Okay, in this last video for this particular week, we're going to look at some other properties you can use to control how your pages look. Well, the first one we're going to look at is outlines. And an outline just enables you to highlight some aspect of a page without affecting the flow of the page in any way, like a border, a physical border would. That's one of the big differences. When you hear the word outline, you probably right away start thinking border. Well, an outline is not the same as a border. And this is a fairly new property. So there's basically two big differences between outlines and the borders that we talked about when we did the box model. One, the outline does not take up any space. It's as if a new layer has been placed on top of your page where this outline is, as opposed to the border that's part of the page and part of the element box. Secondly, outlines do not need to be rectangular. So the outline width property would specify the width of the outline that you want to have added to the box. Its value can be a length or one of the keyword values, just like it was with the border width. So anything that you could use for the border width can be also used for the outline width. The outline style property specifies the style of a line that goes around the box. Again, it's one of the values that you would use for the border style property that we looked at earlier. There's an example of it. And the outline color property. This enables you to specify the color of the outline. And again, just like we saw in the border color or just color in general, you can use any valid color value, whether it be a hexadecimal, a RGB function, or a named color. And then there's a shortcut, the outline property. This shorthand enables you to specify the values of any of the three outline properties. They could be inserted in any order. If you don't use one, just like before, it'll revert to whatever its default is or its inherited state. So if we look at an example of it, we just have a paragraph tag here that has a bold element inside of it, and we're going to deal with this bold element with the outline. So in our style sheet then, for the bold element, we're adding an outline. It's going to be red, 8 pixels thick, so it's really going to stand out, and dash, which is probably a poor choice here, and you'll see why in just a minute. So when we look at this then, you can see that 8 pixel red outline. Notice how it kind of goes on top of the surrounding stuff, so it's not taking up space, it's not pushing things away because it has to take up that space. It's more like being on a separate layer and laying directly on top of it. Then we can add a couple pseudo classes that we haven't talked about yet. These are similar to the hover, link, visit it, and active that we talked about earlier with the link element, the anchor tag. So the focus just enables you to associate some rules, some declaration that you might use when an element gains focus. Now, what can gain focus? Well, any text box, actually any control on a form, images, links, those are the type of things that can gain focus. And you can then control what that looks like when it does gain focus to bring attention to that then to the user. The active we talked about enables you to associate further styles with elements when they are activated, again, as the user is pressing the button down. So in this particular web page, we just have a form, has 3 controls: username, password, 2 text boxes, basically, a text box and a password, and a submit button. In our CSS, then we're using the focus to change the background color to a darker gray, so that when they tab into that or click into it, they'll realize that that's where they're at because the color is different than others. So you can see then we have the lighter gray on all of them. If we start tabbing, notice that now my cursor is inside of this box and it's a little bit darker color than the other box. Tab down to the next one, and now that one has a darker color. Same thing with the login. It has a slightly darker color when I tabbed onto that. So focus is for the class, again, a pseudo class for when someone actually clicks on or tabs into a control. Generated content. In CSS2, we were introduced to a way of adding content either before or after a specified element, even if it was not in the HTML document itself. So we could take content from a style sheet and insert it into the actual page. In CSS3, you might note that pseudo elements are specified with a double colon to differentiate them from the pseudo classes. Prior to that, it was all just both of them, both the pseudo classes as well as the pseudo elements, used just a single colon. So you can see that in the examples here. Here's a double colon here, before the after, before the first, and before the first line. So these are pseudo elements. They have the same specificity as a regular element. So even though the CSS3 has stated that they should have a double colon before them to differentiate them, most browsers still accept them with a single colon as well. Now, up through and including Internet Explorer 8, IE only recognizes the single colon version. So you're going to have to consider your audience when you're building a website. Is it an audience that may be using an older Internet Explorer? If that's the case, then you may want to stick with the single colon. It's not an issue on any of them. If you think most of your people are going to be using newer versions of IE, then you could use the double colon. Either way, for most people, I think you're okay with either the single or the double. The before and after pseudo elements. These enable you to add content before or after each instance of an element defined in a selector. We then use the content property along with these to indicate what content should be added to the document. So if we look at this HTML page, just real simple, has a header, H1 tag, and then a paragraph tag with a class of abstract. In our style sheet then, we're going to take that paragraph tag with a class of abstract and we're going to style it for the after pseudo element. So after any paragraph tag with the class of abstract, this is what we're going to do. And what we're doing is adding the content. In this case, we're going to need to register to read the full article, and then after that content is added, we're going to change the color of it to red. So any other styling rules that you put in here, or declarations that you put in here, any other properties you use, is going to affect the content because this is only after the element. It's not going to affect anything else. So when we run this in our browser then, you see that this has been added. Go back to our HTML and you see that that was not at the end of what we had in our HTML page. Looking at the content a little bit deeper, you could have a string which just inserts plain text. It can contain a URL that points to an image, text file, another HTML page, or even another website. It can be a counter, and we're going to look at this in depth here in just a few moments, but a counter then counts the number of elements, a specific element, and you can use that count then that it saves to number those elements as well on the page. The attribute function, which takes one parameter, one argument, just showing X here, but it would return the value of that attribute. So let's say that you had a style attribute in the particular element. You could then do attr and in the parentheses then put style, and it would return the value of that style. The open quote inserts the appropriate opening quote symbol. The close quote inserts an appropriate closing quote symbol. And then the no open quote or no open close quote do not use any quotes. And we're going to look at the open quote in just a little bit here. The counters. The counter function itself allows you to create a counter that increments each time a browser comes across any specified element. It's very helpful if you want to automatically number sections of a document without them being in a list. Remember, an ordered list will order them or number them as it comes across them. It does that automatically for you. The nice thing about the counter is that it also, just like a list, new items will automatically be numbered if you add or remove some of the same elements from the page. There's two properties that you need to understand here. One is the counter reset property. It's used to establish a counter with the initial value of 0. And by the way, these are only numbers, so you can't change the type. So we couldn't make it letters or Roman numerals or anything like that. It's always going to be numbers. And this counter reset property should be in the body rule. The other one that we'll need is the counter increment property. This declaration should be inside the element rule that is being counted. Keep in mind also that the names of counters are case sensitive. So let's try to pull this together with an example. First of all, in our HTML page, we have a couple H1 headers. We're going to add a counter to count those. And then we're also going to add a counter for the H2s that come after them. So we're going to create kind of like a outline of these elements where they're indented and the numbering changes as they get indented. So now in the style sheet then, the first thing we talked about in the body tag, we initialize those counters. So the counter reset, we're naming one chapter, and we're naming the second one section. Now these are the names of the counters. Once we have them, then we can go to our elements, and you see that we have the counter increment for chapter, and we're resetting the section here. Why are we resetting it? Because each time we come across an H1, we're going into a new chapter, so the H2s that are under it would want to start over in numbering. In our H2 then, we're using the counter increment section. So we're going to increment that section number, and just to give that indentation, we're going to add a left margin of 25 pixels, or margin dash left. And then in our code, using the before pseudo element, before each H1, we're going to add content. Well, that content is a string. It's going to literally say chapter with a space after it, and then it's going to insert the counter, and it's going to grab whatever is in the chapter counter at that time. And then after that, we just close it with a colon and a space, and then it'll say whatever else it has to say. Well, the H2 is a little bit more complicated, not much. Again, we got the H2 before, and we're using the content. But now, we're not going to add the chapter. We're just going to add the chapter counter, put a period there, and then add the counter for the section, and then make sure we have a space at the end, so there's some space separating the counter from the actual content of the H2. So what we end up with then is each H1 ends up with a chapter and its appropriate number in front of it with a colon. It's chapter 1, chapter 2, and then on our H2s, you can see that we've added 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4. So we've gotten the indentation by that margin left, and we've now numbered these and combined numbers. Quotation marks, as I talked about when we went through the list of things on the content, it can use the values of open quote and close quote to add quotation marks before and after occurrence of specified elements. IE8 was the first version of IE to support these properties, so with the modern ones you shouldn't have to worry about it. And they're supported widely in all the other major browsers. So if we look at the HTML for this, for an example, of note is the 3 block quotes. Notice that there's no quotes in here. It's just the text itself. There's no beginning quotes. There's no ending quotes. Using our CSS though, for every block quote before it, we're going to add content, which will be an open quote. And then for every block quote after it, we're going to add content that is close quote. So you can see then when a finished product comes out, we have beginning quotes and we have ending quotes, all put in through this CSS. Some miscellaneous properties that we can use. One would be the cursor. You can actually change the type of mouse cursor that's being displayed to the user. Be sure that you only use these values to add helpful information for users in places they would expect to see a particular cursor. So you wouldn't use, for example, a crosshair if what they're doing is hovering over a link that they want to click on. That's not going to make any sense to them. You can see these on pages 288 through 289, but we can also take a look at a few of them. And in here you see we just have several paragraph tags that have a class. Each class is a different type of cursor that we're going to use. And in our CSS then, for each of those classes we're adding the cursor, the pointer, crosshair, move, text, wait, help, just so you can see a few of these. So you can see all of our paragraph tags here, the help on the bottom, the wait, the text, just the I-beam, the move, the crosshair, and the pointer. So those are some of the different cursors that you could use, and you can see them in your book as well. We also want to talk a little bit more about the display property. This is used to force an element to be either a block level or an inline block. So in other words, you could take a paragraph tag that is a block level and treat it as if it was an inline. Conversely, you could take an anchor tag that is inline tag by default and actually use it as a block level. And in a couple weeks, we'll actually create a menu and do some things very similar to that. So the display has 4 values. It could be block, inline, none, or inline dash block. The inline dash block lets an element flow as if it's an inline, but still allows it to accept some block-like attributes, such as width and height. This is a fairly new one, and you would want to check it out to see if you could use it before you actually implement the inline block. The other 3 have been around for some time. We also have a visibility property. This just enables you to hide a box from view. You do not see the content of the element, but it still takes up space on the page. It still affects the layout. If you want something to disappear without taking up any space, then you would use the display property. We'll take a look at that in our sample. The visibility property has 2 possible values: visible, which is the default state, box and contents are shown to the user, or hidden. The box and its contents are made invisible, although they still exist and affect the layout of the page. So in our HTML, we just have 4 paragraphs, one that has a class of invisible. In our style sheet then, a paragraph tag with a class of invisible, we're going to set the visibility to hidden. We'll look at this display in just a second. So start off visibility hidden. Remember, it was the 3rd paragraph that actually has that class. And when we run it, you can see that that 3rd paragraph is no longer there, but it's still taking up the space that it would if it was there. So we go back to our style sheet now, and we're going to X out the invisible and show you the difference here between that and display none. Save that. With display none, it's not only going to not show it, as you see here, but it's also going to tell everything that came after it that, hey, this doesn't exist anymore. We can all move up. So when we refresh this, you'll see the difference. That fourth paragraph actually now moved up to take up the space that was being saved with visibility hidden for the third paragraph. So big difference between visibility and display none. Visibility hidden, you can't see it, it still takes up space. Display none, not only can you not see it, but it no longer takes up the space, and any content that comes after it flows into the space that it would have normally occupied. A couple additional rules. The at import rule. This enables you to import style sheets from another style sheet. It must appear at the very beginning of the style sheet. You can't have some rules, declaration blocks, and then have this later on. It has to be at the very beginning, and it enables you to modularize your style sheets. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, you could have a style sheet that you use specifically for forms. You could have a style sheet you use specifically for pages that have galleries of pictures on it. You could have different style sheets that have certain color layouts to them. And you could reuse these over and over rather than copying and pasting them into one. You just import the other one. The same thing can be accomplished by using the link element as well, where you just link the various style sheets. With the difference between having two style sheets linked, one on top of the other, here you're actually importing the second one into the first one, so you would only have one link. Keep in mind also that the rules of precedence still apply. So if something was to be duplicated between the at import style sheet and the rules that are down below, the one that comes below it would overwin it because it comes last. So keep that in mind as well. There's two different ways you could do this. It takes a URL value. It allows you to do it without the URL function, or you could use the URL function as well, as you see in these two examples. So if we look at this example, the important thing here is you're going to see the class here code in text and a class here that's going to code the foreground. I point those out because in our style sheet you see neither of those. Neither of those classes exist in the style sheet. However, look at the very beginning, we're importing code style CSS. When we import that, all the styles from it then are now part of the same. So here is the code in text. It's going to be a courier and bold, and the foreground, which changes the background color, padding, margin, letter spacing, and display. Actually just changed it to a display block, which we just talked about. So those, even though they're not part of the style sheet that's being linked, they are part of the style sheet because it was imported within the style sheet. So you can see then the change in the type style here, and with this one that was inline, it's now a block level. It's got a background. We know it's blocked because it's on a separate line now instead of being within the line, and it spreads the entire width of its container. We'll talk more about that in 2 weeks. And lastly is the explanation point important rule. Use this wisely, but you could use the explanation point important rule to indicate a particular rule should take precedence over others. It's helpful if you want to develop modular style sheets. The reason there would be that you might have something in one of the imported style sheets in a current style sheet, want to make sure that it applies even if it's duplicated in one of the imported ones. So you use the explanation point important then to make sure that that one overrides any others. You see this used fairly often in print style sheets as well, to override some of the settings so that it prints the way we want it to print. And you may not be totally aware of this, but users can create their own style sheets. There's actually a program that you can add to Firefox that allows you to look at any website and modify their style sheet to see what it would look like if you changed it without actually making changes. But the fact that users making their own style sheets, it's not very common. And all you would do is simply put the important after the rule and before the closing semicolon, as you see in both of these examples. So no matter what else was going on, this paragraph tag is going to be 18 points and bold.